The Afghan Taliban is warning people in Kabul to stay away from military centers, promising a new wave of attacks. Sadly, that headline is not really breaking news anymore. Afghanistan has seen more than 16 years of bloodshed in what was initially promised by Washington as a war on terror that would stamp out Taliban forces for good. New insight into what's gone wrong in those efforts has come out in the book Directorate S, the CIA and America's Secret Wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The book's author is the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Steve Coll, who joins us now from New York. Steve, thank you very much indeed for your time. Can we go back in history, first of all, and look at how possibly and what role the United States may have played, perhaps even unwittingly, in the creation of the Taliban in terms of the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet invaders, the Soviets being defeated, and then how the Mujahideen morphed into the Taliban?
Well, the CIA collaborated with Pakistan's intelligence service during the 1980s, as you say, to build up the Mujahideen resistance to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. But in that collaboration, the CIA let the Pakistanis choose which militias were most favored, and the Pakistanis, for their own reason, tended to favor extremist groups, particularly those around Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. After the Soviets withdrew, as you point out, the Mujahideen fell into a civil war, partly along ethnic lines, partly along ideological lines. And it was out of that chaos that the Taliban rose. Now, it's debated as to whether they were always an ISI Pakistani creation or whether they were seized upon by the ISI fairly quickly after they emerged. But there's no doubt that they became a creature of Pakistani intelligence during the mid-1990s. By that time, the United States had left Afghanistan, but it was this policy of allowing the Pakistanis to favor extremist groups that I think fed into the Taliban's rise.
Do you think the US also possibly took its eye off the ball when the Taliban were emerging as the dominant force in Afghanistan, and then when they came to power, and then when they were harboring, even working with Osama bin Laden?
Yeah, certainly in the early 1990s, the United States pulled out of Afghanistan altogether, despite its contributions to the Civil War and to the violence that had unfolded during the 1980s. The United States essentially abandoned the country and left Pakistan holding the difficulties of cross-border violence, of guns, heroin addiction, large refugee population. And when the Taliban emerged, the United States still remained barely a factor in Afghanistan, providing some humanitarian aid, but not really challenging the Taliban's extremist rule. Now, when Osama bin Laden and Al-qaeda found shelter in Afghanistan starting in 1996, and when they began to carry out overseas attacks, for example, against 2 U.S. embassies in Africa in 1998, at that point, the CIA did get back involved, trying to find ways to thwart Al-qaeda and bin Laden. However, the policy was just to concentrate on international terrorism and not to really deal with the realities of poverty and brutal rule by the Taliban in Afghanistan. It was as if Al-qaeda and terrorism could be isolated from the broader problems of Afghanistan, and that proved to be a misreading of the situation.
So how much of a role has Pakistan played in propping up the Taliban since it was removed from power in 2001?
Well, initially in 2001, after the September 11th attacks, the Pakistan army, led then by Pervez Musharraf, did decide to abandon the Taliban to its fate and switch sides, essentially, joining the US-led coalition. But they did so reluctantly and under pressure, feeling they had no real choice. And after the Taliban fell, Pakistan right away believed that the new government in Afghanistan was unfriendly, too unfriendly to Pakistan to be acceptable. But it didn't immediately move to revive the Taliban. It was only really 2003, 2004, after the new Afghan government had consolidated its position with successful elections and a negotiated new constitution. And also the United States started to signal that it was again leaving Afghanistan, going off now to fight a troubled and increasingly deteriorating war in Iraq. At that point, I think the Pakistani generals said to themselves, well, we're left again to our own devices. We have to prosecute our own interests, and the Taliban comeback began. By 2006, I think there's evidence that the Pakistani government had made a full-throated decision to support the Taliban's comeback. And indeed, by that time, by 2006, the Taliban constituted a full-strength insurgency in many parts of Afghanistan, particularly in the south and east.
So, Steve, we're talking a lot about governments at the moment. There's an element here which, of course, you concentrate very heavily on in your book, the ISI intelligence agency in Pakistan. How independent is that of the Pakistani government? And have you found a smoking gun? Is it in the book that shows the link between the ISI and the Afghan Taliban?
Well, there's no real doubt about links between the ISI and the Afghan Taliban. It's lying in plain sight. The Afghan leadership, the Taliban leadership lives in Pakistan. They receive medical care. They go back and forth from Pakistan to Afghanistan unmolested. They're not being arrested. The Pakistani government would say, well, we can't locate them. We don't know where they are. But I don't think anyone regards that as a credible claim overall. But you ask an important question: how much does this really express top-down Pakistani state policy, and how much of it is them trying to ride the tiger of an insurgent group that they can't always control? There are certainly elements of both at play. ISI is a creature of the Pakistan military. It's commanded by a three-star general. It reports directly to the head of the army. It's not a rogue organization. But down in its ranks, there are contractors and independent allies. And of course, this is all constructed, just as intelligence services do elsewhere in the world, to create deniability, to provide the Pakistani state with some space to say, well, that's not really our terrorist attack. We can't control these groups. And the Pakistani state is not, a monster. It's not an all-powerful entity. It has its own sources of weakness and corruption that prevent it from controlling everything that goes on in its system. But there's plenty of evidence, both in the open sources, for example, around the Mumbai attack, and in other kinds of channels that show direct collaboration between Pakistani retired army officers and groups on very ambitious terrorist strikes.
I'd like you to give us an illustration of the mess that Afghanistan is at the moment, and therefore the challenges that American intelligence agencies, even Pakistani intelligence agencies, who may have different aims, as we're discussing in Afghanistan, but the challenges they may face in Afghanistan. Can you recount that story that's in your book about the suicide bomber that went to say goodbye to his family? I think that's a good illustration of the situation in Afghanistan.
Well, I think you're referring to a chapter that describes how American intelligence and, to some extent, the Pakistan Army operating in Waziristan tried to get a grip on who these suicide bombers, who seemed to be inspired by tactics in the Iraq War, who they really were, and how they were being persuaded to take their own young lives in the cause of the Taliban's revolution. And one of the patterns that these investigators discovered was that the bombers themselves were often very young and very naive and poorly trained, and that they would often detonate themselves before they had really reached their target. You had 14, 15-year-old boys being asked to drive cars at high speeds and crash into military convoys, having never driven a car before, and of course, under the most intense psychological pressure that it's possible to imagine. They were also being drugged in some cases and given sedatives of various kinds. The story you referred to is a young man who went to say goodbye to his parents before seeking martyrdom and accidentally detonated himself in their company, killing himself and his parents. But it was a sad picture of cynical ideological manipulation by some of these groups and young men who didn't have the social or political kind of power to resist the role that they were being asked to play, sometimes even by their own families.
Is Afghanistan a failed state? And if you answer in the affirmative, is that because of outside interference or because of domestic incompetence?
Well, Afghanistan was invaded by the Soviet Union in 1979 and has more or less been at war ever since. It was not a war that was caused by internal fracturing. It was a war that was started by an outside invasion, and ever since, Afghanistan's violence has been shaped by both outside interference and internal conflict and incompetency. Afghanistan is not a failed state in the sense that there is an Afghan nation that lived at peace with itself and its neighbors through most of the 20th century, and that continues to try to resurrect itself despite the enormous pressures of violence and cross-border interference in Afghanistan's conflicts from Pakistan, as well as from the rest of the international community, which has overloaded Afghanistan with aid and fostered corruption through, short-sighted policies. But is Afghanistan a failed state? It's a failing state that is being propped up by international subsidy and international support. It has, like a lot of other poor countries, required international assistance just to pay its budget for many decades. But there's still a strong sense of nationalism. There's a generation that's come of age in the cities in Afghanistan since 2001. It's very plugged into the world, very determined, very resilient. It's remarkable that Afghanistan puts up with the failures of policy that it has had to endure from the United States and the international community. And part of what that shows, I think, is a strong desire among the great majority of Afghanistans to have their country back and to end this war that is often fueled across the border from Pakistan that they face against the Taliban.
Steve Coll, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Newsmakers.